Good afternoon. I am Tony Benutt, the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression, and I am delighted to welcome you to this conversation on free speech and student fears. To state the obvious, these are challenging times for higher education. Passions flare, straining reasoned discussion. Core to many of our missions, we're joined over live stream by those from several colleges and universities, is knowledge, truth, and discovery. Conditions that threaten their flourishing strike at our ability to fulfill our missions. Let me also say that we planned and promoted this event long before pro-Palestinian encampments emerged on many of our campuses. I imagine we could have titled this Free Speech, Protest, and Student Fears. And I have no doubt that our conversation will get into the intersecting issues at the heart of free inquiry and contemporary campus dynamics and culture. We will not agree on solutions or approaches. We may not even see the challenges from the same angle or define those challenges similarly. But the work we do at its best is about the proactive engagement of those very complexities. When things are difficult, when things are fraught, when things are complicated, that is precisely when we need to lean in. And we have an excellent set of lead conversation partners with which to do so. Robert Pape is professor of political science at the University of Chicago, specializing in international security. His publications include Cutting the Fuse, The Explosion of Global Suicide Terrorism and How to Stop It, Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, and Bombing to Win, Air Power and Coercion in War. He's a regular public commentator and has appeared on the pages of the New York Times, The Washington Post, New Republic, and many more, and over the air on Nightline, ABC News, CBS News, CNN, and National Public Radio. He is the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. Most pertinent to our time today, he is the author of the new study, Understanding Campus Fears, After October 7, and How to Reduce Them, based on 3 national surveys of US college students and American adults. Jeffrey Stone is the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor of Law here at the University of Chicago and the author of several books on constitutional law, among them Security, Leaks, and Freedom of the Press, The Free Speech Century, Perilous Times, Free Speech in Wartime, Eternally Vigilant, Free Speech in the Modern Era. He is an editor of 2 leading casebooks, Constitutional Law and the First Amendment, and was appointed by President Obama to serve on the President's Review Group on Intelligence and Communications Technologies. And quite pertinent to this conversation, he also chaired the committee that produced what became known as the Chicago Principles nearly a decade ago. I have the honor of moderating our discussion, a collaboration of the Chicago Forum along with the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. We take as our starting point the latest research from Professor Robert Pape and begin with his overview of the findings, then proceed to Professor Stone's response and a conversation between them. We'll save ample time for audience participation. We'll take questions and comments from those here in the auditorium as well as those of you tuning in on the live stream. For those on the live stream, please note you can simply send questions to the email address listed on the bottom of your screen. Finally, this event is offered through the Chicago Forum Zell Speaker Series, made possible through the lead support of the Zell Family Foundation. There will be time for a light reception after the event for those here in the auditorium. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Pape.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tony. That was terrific. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, the Chicago Forum, for partnering with us with us for this event. Thank you, Jeff, for being part of this event. I have admired Jeff for a long time. We've done a few things together in the past, but I couldn't think of a better person to have here talking today. And I'd like to thank all those who are online. We actually have quite a large number of folks online, and many are at universities, and we really appreciate them, and we're really looking forward to your online questions. And lastly, thank you to the audience. Thank you for coming here. It's a very fraught time, and so the fact that you made your way here has just been terrific. Today, I want to share with you the results of our recent study, which is the most extensive that now exists about anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and college students in the wake of October 7. The purpose of this study is to provide university and national political leaders, campus communities, and the general public with the best information possible, not just about what they're watching on their screens, but what's happening under the waterline on college campuses across the country. Information that only nationally representative surveys can get at. Today, I will briefly explain who I am, why we did this study, the core findings, and the main recommendations. There is much more in the full 455-page report, and I encourage you to go to the CPOST website. Just as I said that, right? I encourage you to go to the CPOST website to see it for yourself. As for me, I'm a scholar who's been studying political violence for 30 years, focusing heavily on terrorism and propaganda, mostly related to overseas conflicts in Bosnia, Israel, Palestine, Iraq, and Afghanistan. For the past 4 years, I have intensely studied political violence in the United States, leading research teams at the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats on numerous studies related to the riots during the George Floyd protests, the January 6th Capitol insurrection, the overlap of anti-Semitism and support for political violence prior to October 7. The study we're talking about today was conceived early last November and motivated by a straightforward concern: the emergence of violent threats against Jews and Muslims in the wake of the unrest on campuses and in cities after October 7. This slide shows you some of the most prominent instances. However, those incidents are just the tip of the iceberg. Both the ADL and CARE, the most prominent grassroots Jewish and Muslim organizations, have extensively documented literally thousands of incidents of harm since October 7, many of which have occurred against college students. Now, as I said, our study provides the most extensive data to date on anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and campus fears. We also measured anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in multiple ways. I'm glad to talk about that in Q&A when we get to it. And also studied the impact of different understandings of protest chants. As Tony said, the study is based on 3 surveys. 2 new nationally representative surveys of 5,000 current college students from over 600 academic institutions, and 5,000 American adults fielded from mid-December to mid-January, as well as a 3rd survey conducted prior to October 7 that provides a nationally representative baseline. All the surveys were fielded by polling agencies with the highest standards of quality and reliability for their respective target populations: NORC at the University of Chicago and College Pulse. And again, if you'll forgive me, I'll skip some of the technical details. They're available on the website, or we can talk about them in Q&A. Now let's discuss the findings, beginning with what we learned about campus fears. Perhaps our most important discovery is that campus fears are more intense and widespread than previously known. Up to 1 in 5 college students report feeling in personal danger due to their support of Israel or the Palestinians. Jewish students are the most impacted, but so too are others heavily impacted. Specifically, 56 of all Jewish students report feeling in personal danger, closely followed by 52% of Muslim students who feel in personal danger, and 16% of students who are not Jewish and not Muslim also report feeling in personal danger in the wake of October 7. This equates to fears among 2 to 3 million current college students today. Those numbers could well be higher, in fact, just literally in the last 2 weeks, after the escalation of the campus unrest that we have witnessed. Now, our report breaks down the data in more detail and granularity, showing the specific questions that we asked, the sample sizes in different categories. The key thing I want to mention today, though, is our findings are extremely homogeneous across the 600 academic institutions the students came from. There have been lots of questions about whether it's certain private institutions or it's certain parts of the country where the institutions are located. Our data just doesn't find much of a difference. It's essentially flat across public-private. It's essentially flat across different parts of the country. Indeed, when we issued the report in March, we were concerned about the potential for widespread, renewed escalation on college campuses, particularly if new escalatory triggers occurred because the passions we found in the report had not truly cooled. Alas, we were not surprised that over 100 schools as of today have reportedly experienced unrest in the last 2 weeks. The key lesson is that even if all campus unrest across the country stopped today on a dime, we would need to prepare for renewed unrest and even potential escalation in just a few weeks, over the summer, when many colleges have summer programs, and in the fall, which is really only a few months away. As escalation can suddenly occur in the Middle East, that's what happened on October 7, so too can escalation suddenly occur on college campuses. Why do the students feel afraid? We asked the students to tell us. We asked them directly, why do they feel personally in danger due to their support of either Israel or Palestine in the wake of October 7? Over 1,000 of those students told us why they felt in personal danger. And all 1,000 answers are published in our report. That's one of the reasons it's so thick. As you will see today, there are real dangers as well as protest speech that are playing a role. Here is why Jewish students say they are afraid. Essentially, their answers come in 2 buckets. Many say their fears are reactions to protest speech. For example, a Jewish student writes, "When I hear thousands of people on my campus cheering to globalize the Intifada and from the river to the sea, I worry." Another Jewish student says, "As a Jew, we have been all told to die." However, many also report observing acts of violence and intimidation happening right in front of them, not just on TikTok. For example, a Jewish student writes, "Protesters chant for the death of Jews and then storm the Jewish buildings." Another says, "I wore a Star of David necklace and was booed while I was just going for a walk, and people have accused me of supporting genocide." Another says, "While running a fundraiser for emergency services in Israel, my friends and I were threatened by a Palestinian man that he would, quote, kill us all. Our fraternity house was vandalized, and the synagogue 3 miles from campus had swastikas painted on the doors." Let's see what Muslim students say. Muslim students report feeling in personal danger for similar reasons. Although with Muslim students, they tend to emphasize fear of a backlash. Fear of a backlash. For example, one Muslim student says they feel afraid because of hostility from students on campus after the anti-Semitic attacks that I do not feel reflect the pro-Palestinian agenda. Another Muslim student wrote, lack of college administration help. That shows up a lot. Another wrote, one of my professors said that Gaza needs to be destroyed and cleaned out because he implied that Muslims and all Palestinians are terrorists and hate Jews. I am not Palestinian, but as a Muslim, this felt very isolating, and the fact that he could say it out in the open and not face any consequences was what made me feel afraid even more. And as with Jewish students, many Muslim students also report observing acts of violence and intimidation happening right in front of them, not on TikTok. A Muslim student wrote, in caps, someone tried to run me over and called me a terrorist for wearing a scarf. Another writes, I've been called a terrorist sympathizer and had my headscarf ripped off. Now, I could go on, but I want you to go to the report. And as you will see in the report, there are literally hundreds of answers by Jewish and Muslim students that look just like these. And there are hundreds more, even larger numbers, by students who are not Jewish and not Muslim, who also report similar sets of fears. And they're saying, I'm not going to show the non-Muslim and non-Jewish students, but they're saying that people are trying and saying they want to kill them for support of Israel. Some want to kill them for support of Palestine. Some want to kill them just because they're too neutral and viewed as neutrality is not viewed as acceptable. And in the media, just in the last few weeks, we are seeing many reports by journalists of fears that look exactly like those we documented in the study. Now, our data also tells us more about why protest chants are playing a role in fears. Essentially, we found a tragic misunderstanding driving some portion of student fears, and that misunderstanding is something we can do something about. Specifically, we asked students what they thought of the famous protest chant, the pro-Palestinian protest chant, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. We asked them, what do you think that means? And this is important to ask the meaning, not just can they name the river and the sea, because feelings of threat come from what someone hears, not what a speaker intends to say. For fears, perception is the reality. And we found that 26% of all college students, that's the equivalent of 4 million students in college today, understand the phrase from the river to the sea to mean the expulsion and genocide of Israeli Jews. Jewish students have this understanding the most. 66% of Jewish students understand that chant as a call for genocide. And by the way, 62% of that group report feeling afraid. But only 14% of Muslim students understand the chant as a call for genocide. What does this mean? This means that different perceptions of intent are likely playing a role in those campus fears. Importantly, we also found the calls for genocide matter widely, not just among Jewish or Muslim students. Students who interpret from the river to the sea to mean genocide of the Jews are more than twice as likely to report feeling threatened, even when we remove all the Jews and all the Muslims from the analysis. Our study also found strong support for calming actions. We asked a variety of questions about different ideas for calming. For example, about public statements by leaders condemning violence and steps to encourage greater empathy and trust by learning more about the history of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Basically, we found the same results across all the questions. I'm only showing you two here, but they're very similar across all the group. We found that large majorities of both college students and Americans in general support just about all the calming actions to the same degree. Now, to be sure, there are small minorities that read who disagree, but most people want more calming actions from their leaders and institutions, not silence. Now, given our findings, it is crucial for university and national leaders to take meaningful calming actions beyond crowd control measures, because the hopes that campus unrest will simply fade away are not working out. Some of those steps are important to do right now, this week, next week. Some are important to do over the summer. All are important to do by the fall. 4 steps are most important. First, widely publicize calming statements. Every leader in a position of power, and I mean every leader in a position of power at a university, at college, and every leader in a position of power in the country politically, should send the message repeatedly and convincingly that any kind of violence against any group of people is never justified. Second, inform future speech, not hastily restrict speech. For example, clarify the tragic misunderstanding. Widely share the information we now have about the common different meanings of from the river to the sea that many do not realize. That one small step does not require ending protests, does not require changing the position on Israel or Palestine. That one step could bring some calm. And what's the downside? We should do that this week. Every institution should do that. Another example is we should inform about violent consequences for calls for genocide and mass harm. We're an academic institution. We have a ton of academic work about the consequences of violent speech. And we're not using that to inform future speech. We should widely share the historical, the qualitative, the quantitative, and the experimental studies that consistently find that violent rhetoric encourages actual violence. And what's the harm in doing this? Again, we should be doing this week. Okay, take a week to get the bibliography. We should do this in 2 weeks. Why are we waiting to inform people on college campuses about crucial issues that they just may not know that much about? Third, clarify campus rules. October 7th caught everyone by surprise, and no campus policy was written to deal with the central issue that's new today and new in our era. And that issue is, are calls for genocide and mass harm to people acceptable on campus? Our surveys show that over 75% of students think that calls for genocide are unacceptable. But that's not everyone. And so universities and colleges need to clarify, where do they stand on this crucial issue? Silence is not helping the students and the campus community to understand what the policy is. Fourth, recognize that a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict is the only approach that avoids zero-sum outcomes. Not just zero-sum outcomes overseas in the Middle East, but zero-sum outcomes and highly violent outcomes on campuses and in US cities. We need to see that without that solution on the table, it is a zero-sum game. And that is going to lead to continuing rounds of what we're experiencing, whether we want it to do or not, whether we hope it fades away or not. Now, just this morning, we had an example of a strong, calming statement by a political leader. Now, CPOST is a nonpartisan organization at the University of Chicago. On our CPOST board, we have Republicans, we have Democrats. Just want to emphasize that because I'm going to show you a clip. And if I'm going to show you one leader speaking, and it's a political leader of some note, probably going to be either a Republican or a Democrat. So please understand that I understand you'll wonder. But I am not showing you this for partisan reasons. I'm showing you that there, in fact, are examples today of a leader who's fulfilling what I'm calling about this strong public statement to condemn violence. That leader was Joe Biden, the President of the United States, this morning at 10 a.m. Chicago time. Now, many of you may have been busy. You may have missed this. And so what I want to do is I want to play for you about 1 minute and 10 seconds of this clip, which is pretty much the length of his statement. And I think I just push, okay? I'm being told by the real expert here to just push the button.
To speak for a few moments about what's going on our college campuses here. We've all seen the images, and they put to the test two fundamental American principles, excuse me. The first is the right to free speech and for people to peacefully assemble and make their voices heard. The second is the rule of law. Both must be upheld. But let's be clear about this as well. There should be no place on any campus, no place in America for anti-Semitism or threats of violence against Jewish students. There is no place for hate speech or violence of any kind, whether it's anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or discrimination against Arab Americans or Palestinian Americans. It's simply wrong. There's no place for racism in America. It's all wrong. It's un-American. I understand people have strong feelings and deep convictions. In America, we respect the right and protect the right for them to express that. But it doesn't mean anything goes. It needs to be done without violence, without destruction, without hate, and within the law.
Notice that that statement acknowledges the tensions, recognizes both violent anti-Semitism and violent Islamophobia, and condemns violence on all sides, including among those likely to support him. Now think about that. We need more leaders to take that step. It's all too easy for one leader to condemn violence by the other party. It's all too easy to say nothing. That's not what we saw this morning. And this is not somebody who's ahead in the polls. This is somebody who's really seeing what's happening on college campuses and is taking a stand, at least in this statement, for America. Now, these 4 steps, they won't solve everything. Absolutely they won't. But calming fears for some can cascade into calm for many, while preserving freedom of speech and rights to protest for meaningful change. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pape. That was really amazing. And the research that you've done on all of this is just quite extraordinary. I've been asked to speak primarily, or maybe exclusively, because of my interest in and expertise in freedom of speech, academic freedom, and the First Amendment. And so I think it would be helpful for me to offer a bit of a perspective about those issues. First thing it's important to understand is how much we as a nation have learned over time about free speech. The truth is that throughout our history, there have been widespread suppression of speech that was uncomfortable for people in power or others. Classic examples of this were during World War I, when the federal government prosecuted, convicted several thousand individuals and sentenced them for 10 or more years in prison because of their criticism of the war or the draft. And the Supreme Court of the United States held that the First Amendment of the Constitution, which says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, was not violated by that. Later, 40 years later, during the Red Scare, the federal government prosecuted the leaders of the Communist Party of the United States. And they were convicted, and the case came to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the court again upheld the convictions and held that in these circumstances it was appropriate for the government to punish these individuals. The court has learned, the justices have learned over time from their mistakes. Looking back, and these are just two of many examples I could offer, looking back, they have recognized that by not giving much more robust and aggressive protection to free speech, we invite all sorts of suppression of ideas that people do not like, that make them uncomfortable, that make them afraid. And that if we allow that kind of speech to be punished, then we simply invite more and more claims that, oh, this speech is dangerous, oh, this speech is fearful. And that winds up seriously distorting the nature of public discourse by suppressing particular points of view that should be heard. Today in our nation, the protection of free speech under the First Amendment is quite robust. One dramatic example of that is that the Supreme Court has emphatically rejected the proposition that there is such a thing as hate speech that can be punished consistent with the Constitution. The court has essentially concluded, every justice, by the way, who has addressed that issue in the last half century has agreed, whether they're appointed by Republican or Democratic presidents, whether liberal or conservative, that the concept of hate speech is both too vague to be a basis for restricting what people say, and also can easily be manipulated by those who are enforcing the law to punish those whose speech they don't like while allowing the speech that they are supportive of. So we now have come to a point in this nation where we do have a quite extraordinary protection of free speech, particularly when it is aimed at restricting the message that individuals are communicating. And that lesson is critical for a democracy. Now let me say a little bit about universities. I've only been given 10 minutes, so I have to be brief. With respect to universities, it's important to understand that in the 19th century, in the early part of the 19th century certainly, universities had no commitment to what we would today consider academic freedom. Their view basically was that the role of colleges and universities was to teach students the right thing. And the right thing was a given. And there was little opportunity for or support of any kind of debate, deliberation, criticism, or ideological conflict. That began to change in the years after the Civil War, in the era of Darwinism, in which many colleges and universities suppressed any teaching of evolution because it was incompatible with what was the truth. That was deeply upsetting and disturbing to many academics, and that led to the beginning of the notion of what we would today regard as academic freedom, that universities are committed to open, free, aggressive, challenging, difficult debate and argument. That is how we achieve the ultimate goals of the university. Now, that was not at all the case throughout even much of the 20th century for many universities. During the World War I era, again, many universities fired faculty and expelled students for criticizing the war or the draft, just as the Supreme Court convicted them. And during the Communist era, most universities refused to allow people who were advocating the values of communism to speak at their universities, and refused to allow students to have organizations that were regarded as communist. Similarly, during the Civil Rights era, universities in the South refused to allow speakers or student groups who challenged the segregation policies that had existed in this country and the racism that had existed in this country. And professors were fired, students were expelled and punished, and so on. So universities themselves have had a hard time coming to where most of us are today, just like the Supreme Court. This university has been exceptional in all of this. From its very founding, the University of Chicago defined itself as committed to academic freedom and freedom of speech. The idea was not to teach students what was known, but to challenge, to question, to explore, to disagree, and to be open to all sorts of ideas and values and arguments that were often highly controversial and problematic to others. If we as a nation did not have that set of values, we might not today, for example, have things like same-sex marriage, or we would not have had legal abortion, and all sorts of other issues, which were the product, at some time in the past, would have been regarded as obscene, absolutely absurd. No. But the openness to listening and thinking about those things became critical, both for our democracy and for our education process. As I said, the University of Chicago has been a national leader, the national leader, in these issues, both with its Calvin Report, adopted in the late 1960s, in which, at a time when there was great pressure on universities to criticize the Vietnam War, the university took the position in the Calvin Report that we do not take positions. That if we take positions, that will silence, that will chill the willingness of faculty and students to take different positions. It is essential that the university remain neutral with respect to these values. And then 10 years ago, we adopted what came to be known as the Chicago Principles, which again aggressively protected the right of students and faculty members on campus to express ideas that were controversial, provocative, hurtful, and challenging. And that's been now adopted by, I'm told, more than 100 other colleges and universities. Now, what does that have to do with all we heard earlier? The fear that exists today, and I do want to say I'm a little skeptical, because it's in the interest of these students to say they're afraid. And therefore, I'm a little skeptical about whether these numbers actually reflect a deep degree of fear, as opposed to an answer that they think is in their own interest to offer. But it's the case, no doubt, that there is a substantial degree of fear that exists across college campuses today. And in my view, the right way to address that is by having open discussion about the issues that people are concerned about. It is to allow protests. It is to allow people to express their views. It's to allow them to disagree with one another, even when that disagreement seems hateful. And part of, however, the university's role is to educate its students and faculty to engage in civil discourse, in constructive discourse, in intelligent discourse, not to be throwing rocks or punching people or engaging in threats or engaging in speech that they intend to be harmful and hurtful rather than persuasive. it's essential that universities undertake that responsibility and educate students and faculty to that value. I do think we meaning universities across the country now, as we've heard, need to be much more assertive in doing that. And I think a lot of the challenges we face today are due to our failures to educate our students about the importance of tolerating views with which they disagree, even views that they find hateful. Thank you.
Excellent. Wow, thank you both. You've given us a lot to ingest and think about, and you've clearly articulated some nuanced differences in how you think about this and approach it. So maybe to start, I'd love to hear you each say a little bit more about, as you put it, Bob, like when it comes to fear, I think you said perception is the reality. Professor Stone, you just expressed skepticism, but I think I also heard you say, even if there are things we need to do to foster a climate of exchange and civility. Say more about perception as reality.
So let me,
when it comes to fear and
let me broaden it just a little bit. That when it comes to both fear and encouraging harm, perception is the reality. So just to build on a little bit more of what I briefly mentioned about academic studies. So one of the things that we think we've learned, now of course you never really fully learn something as an academic, you're always challenging yourself and so forth. But again, there's consistent findings over decades across multiple different methods that the more there is support for political violence, and it's public support for political violence, the more fear and the more actual violence that we see. Rwanda, Radio Rwanda, multiple studies about the impact of broadcasting that hate speech, and that led to the mass genocide, or at least contributed to the mass genocide of over 800,000 people. That's just one example, and there's many examples and many different studies in history. To ignore that we're not just talking about support for a political position, we're not talking about support for, say, communism or Nazi Germany in World War I, but we're literally talking about the acceptability of calling for the mass extermination of people, some of whom are right here on campus. That's a pretty serious step. Now, maybe it is right that we should just do nothing about that. That may, I am, as my research staff knows, I'm nothing if not open to conflicting viewpoints. Sometimes they have to push pretty hard, though, I'll tell you. But it is the case. I'm not really fully settled on where I come down on this exactly, but I'm certainly more open to some change, revision, or addition. Another step I would say is that I could also imagine that instead of changing, deleting old rules, after all, we had a need for something 10 years ago, or else we wouldn't have done something 10 years ago. Maybe this is more about applying old rules in new circumstances. Or thirdly, notice the principle I really pushed in the report and in the talk was informing future speech. You see, what's left out of the Calvin report is, while we have the mission to create new ideas and to educate students, and therefore we should not suppress, and then it says, well, but people can say what they want. Well, wait a minute. If we're talking about mass extermination, which can include people right here on my campus, don't we have a little bit more of an obligation to inform about the consequences of that speech? Or inform, just again, not to suppress, but this is about trying to help students, faculty, governments make better decisions, knowing that that is now suddenly on the table.
Right, when you talked about this, you talked about tragic misunderstandings.
Yes.
Of how different populations hear common protest chants.
Well, and let me just say one more, I'll just say one more word about this, which is in study of political violence, we call it today conspiracy theory. But this idea of gossip has been around a long time, and rumor has been around a long time. And notice at UCLA, there was the rumor, somebody's got a gun. And so, well, that rumor, conspiracy theory, gossip, we know from our studies of political violence, is extremely incendiary. And it can cause spiral effects that can kick in. Well, I would just simply point out yet again, another avenue here where there are opportunities to inform about the potential misunderstandings, as I'm explaining.
Please respond.
I mean, again, my response to that would be, as predicted, that the danger of trying to restrict speech is that it leads to abuse. If you give universities or the government or the states or whatever the power to restrict speech because they think it is evil or harmful, what we've learned from our own experience is they abuse it. They abuse it for political reasons, they abuse it for whatever reasons, serve their own self-interest, and they say this is what we're doing,
right.
But they don't do it even-handedly. And that's a real danger, both to democracy and to academic freedom. And so the skepticism that the Supreme Court has come to have about these issues, I think is correct. And that you just don't want to trust people with the power to silence others because they don't like what they say. Now, when you talk about people advocating genocide, right? Obviously, advocating genocide is bad, right? Genocide is obviously bad. But what the Supreme Court has come to say is that you cannot punish someone for advocating even unlawful conduct like genocide unless it is likely to occur imminently. Right. And again, the reason for that is because of a distrust of those in positions of power. What does it mean to say advocate genocide, right? That can be ambiguous. And if you criticize Israel or you say things about the river and the sea and so on, all of those things can be interpreted in that way. So I think one of the things universities have to recognize, and the nation has recognized, is that we need to be very distrustful. That does not mean we should not have free and open and educative discussions. It doesn't mean that faculty members should not speak out about, we think it's inappropriate to talk in certain ways. We think it's unprofessional. But punishing is different.
Right.
And it's an educational institution, and that's what we should do, is educate.
And I don't hear Professor Pape talking about restrictions or punishment in that sense. I hear a call for calming solutions and informing, this verb informing is interesting, future speech, not restriction. So I do wonder if there's some middle ground. You certainly articulated in a century of Supreme Court jurisprudence, we've learned some things about giving government the power to restrict speech and how that can be abused. But we are talking about something distinct within the university environment and the responsibility of leaders to help shape the cultures of those environments. Is that?
So we have what I would say a couple different levels. I definitely take seriously, Jeff, what you're saying. And just so folks know, really for decades, I've really learned from Jeff. It's sort of never really had a class with him, but that's not the possible at my point. But it's really just
you can take one of my classes. It'd be okay.
I wish we had the time. My gosh, I wish. So I'm looking forward to that mythical period where we could do that. But what I would say is that I think that what we're really talking about is trying to recognize some of the dangers. Maybe similar to what, when you're on the committee with Michael Morrell. So Morrell's been part of my center, so I know quite a bit about, this. And what we're really what I'm trying to do is sort of play that kind of a role, not to sort of get into the legal part of this, but also to recognize that, that some creative discussion here. And also, folks, I would be perfectly happy if Jeff would lead that committee and we had to persuade Jeff, you see, on the future, because I am that concerned about what you're describing as these unintended negative effects. But let me just point out that ethical obligations can be on the table, not actually just, punitive codes of conduct, and that can be about the informing part that can be very important. And if that were to come from Chicago, I think that would have, that would have some weight and significance in the country. And it might even be better if Chicago, remember you, lead such an effort with other universities in order to sort of take seriously the different sides of this. So I'm not really trying to tell you it's about restricting. I'm really not thinking restricting certainly is the first place to go. I don't think we're doing enough to inform. I don't think we're doing enough to inform at this crucial moment about consequences. And the other surveys that we do on political violence, they tell us that a lot of people, when you push a little bit, like you said, well, if you push them, would they actually, change their mind about their fears? Support for political violence can be that way too. You push them just a little bit. Well, no, I don't really want to get out front. I don't want to be public. No, that's going to go further down. Well, that is another way that we can suppress without suppressing. You see, they're self-restrained because it just turns out that people really have social undesirable. It's undesirable socially for people to do that, and this is something I think we can build on.
I mean, I agree completely that it is appropriate for faculty members and committees to be educating students and faculty about the dangers and the impropriety of addressing issues in certain ways. I don't think the university should be saying, you can't do that.
Right.
Right. So I think it's critical that, and appropriate for faculty members in particular to be doing this. Even for committees, it's a little problematic. For them, if they're going to say, you shouldn't say this, right, even though we're not going to punish you, that's the Calvin issue.
Potential chilling effects.
And it's a Calvin issue. The university is not supposed to take positions, even on issues that seem fairly straightforward. And again, the reason for that is it's not the university's voice, it's our voice. It's the voice of the faculty, it's the voice of the students, not the university telling people what they have to do or even what they should do. And I think that is essential because I don't think we want universities having the freedom to start doing that because I don't trust them. I think, once you allow them to start doing that, I don't know where it goes. But my sense is it's much better to have faculty members educating and talking and debating and discussing the things than it is for the university itself to be taking positions on these issues. And that was the whole point of the Calvin Report.
Right, and I wonder too if there's a distinction between taking a position and cultivating a culture. And I wonder about the responsibility of leadership, both for setting policy, enforcing policy, and all that goes with that, but influencing and cultivating healthy cultures. When you think in the ideal, the university environment is an open exchange of ideas towards a productive end of the flourishing of knowledge.
So another possible way to think about this is that university leaders, not every university leader, but most university presidents or college presidents are also faculty members. And so they're able to speak with different hats. Now that won't quite apply to every single person that would be a leader in a university, but that is another way to think about the ideas that could come about how informing future speech and obligations to inform that future speech could be pushed forward consistent with principles from Calvin without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So you're certainly right to worry about all things that we can't fully foresee. Maybe AI will be able to figure this out for us, but we can't. But I do think that we can recognize that again, the most senior university leaders are quite often not just professors, but they're actually often tenure kind of core part of the professoriate. And they have opportunities to speak in different ways. Just give you one quick example, if I might, from not outside, so we won't just talk about Chicago. I was a professor at Dartmouth for 5 years before I was lucky enough to get the call. There was a famous instance just before I got there, so I missed this, where the president of Dartmouth, his name was Friedman, he had a big debate with the Dartmouth Review. Just before I got there, and the Dartmouth Review was pushing pictures of him. He was Jewish, and pictures of him with Hitler and a mustache. And what he did is he called out the Dartmouth Review editors for a big debate on that green that you're seeing in the news right now in the last few days. And it's written about, you can find out about it, and he just destroyed them. And they ran away. They never came back on campus, so they actually so all those folks you see on TV proudly saying they're part of the Dartmouth Review, they asked them, well, were they actually at Dartmouth when they were part of the Dartmouth Review? Because, and when I was there, it was just completely gone. And it's because he exerted that principle of not suppressing, so he could have literally redlined, you see. That's not what he did. He called them out, used speech or to inform the entire campus community, and I think that was extremely powerful, and I think that's an example of what I mean by looking for more creative ways to inform than simply say, well, no, we can't suppress, so therefore we're going to do nothing.
Well, again, I think that even university presidents and deans and so on are perfectly free to express their own views as long as they make clear they're speaking for themselves. And it's important that they do that when they feel it's appropriate. It's speaking as the university that is more problematic. Because if the university itself can speak, then people have more concern about whether they disagree with it. And you can imagine universities deciding on things like, you know, we don't think that abortion is a good idea, or we don't think same-sex marriage. Maybe this university wouldn't, but others would. And that's something you don't want universities doing. That's what they were doing in the 19th century. They were basically saying that these are the things that are right? And
Yes.
you have to buy into that.
Yeah, and so we're not going to permit Darwinism to be taught here.
Exactly.
We're in a very different age, of course, in a more complex age. There's an underlying subtext I hear in this exchange around, and I think Professor Pape, you underscored this, suggesting that your colleague might chair a new faculty committee and it might be interinstitutional and re-articulate some principles and values. So the underlying question, it seems to me, is it a moment, do you read the current moment as one that necessitates a revisiting of fundamental values? Or are we talking about the application of tried and true values in a different context?
I would start a little smaller. What I'm really struck by is the absence, the problems we see in the report, the problems we see around the country are not happening just in one university. They're not, Columbia is a particular epicenter, and it actually brings together not just the university, but in our studies, a large number of people who are not students are right in line with those students. So the fact that New York City, which has so many people, 25 million, and then you have a large campus with 57,000 or whatever the number is at Columbia, this is no surprise that's an epicenter, but this earthquake is being felt across the country. You see what I mean? So I'm very struck that we are not already seeing circles of discussions here to have discussions. Every university will want, and college want them to have their own policy. I'm not asking them thinking they're going to give up autonomy, but, and I'm sure there's lots of people on phone calls right now, or small circles of 10 maybe, but this is much less than what I think the situation calls for. And I think it was understandable that in the fall, a lot of people hoped we had this, eruption. It all died down. Not going to come back. I know, because a lot of people told me that directly, so I'm extremely familiar with that. But now we've seen the consequences of hoping this will just all fade away. And I think, of course, right now, each university is going to focus on itself. But right now, it's got to be the case that we see this is just a much wider phenomenon. And what happens at Columbia really does matter what happens at UCLA, and really does matter at USC. I mean, the stories coming out about, the suppression at USC, the folks that wanted to do the protesting, they just got on buses and went right to UCLA. I mean, that's what the current story is here. So this idea that they're insulated little islands and, what happens at Chicago stays at Chicago, I don't think this is the world we live in. And so I think we need to recognize some more connectivity. And I don't see that happening.
What would you have universities do in this situation?
Exactly what I'm telling you in this report right now. If they would publicize the tragic misunderstanding, step one, if we had even not 600, but let's say 100 universities all coordinated with that in the next week, that would be a breakthrough,
You
a
think it would
major
actually
step
change
forward.
anything?
Yes, I think it would, because suddenly now we're taking away this idea that there's confusion about what the statement means, and do we really, is it 1 in 100 who thinks it's a call for genocide, or is it only the Jewish community that thinks it's a call for genocide? The numbers are different, so this is an opportunity, and the answer is yes, because this is pushing back on that. You call it hate speech, if you would, but it's not pushing back by suppressing it. It's pushing back by showing that there really are different meanings, and it is the case. It's common, not just among Jews, but it's common for people to hear that as a call for genocide and to be afraid.
But do you think that would actually change anything?
Yes, I think it would restrain people. I think it would make people less likely to adopt that speech. I think it would tend to, the way we deal with terrorism is we don't, the bad way to deal with terrorism is you go in with a giant army and a footprint and you try to, kill those 100 terrorists. Well, we learned that lesson doesn't end terrorism very well. And so if you think about, that's sort of where we are right now. We're in like the search and destroy phase of this, where we're making all the mistakes. And I see this all the time. We do this overseas all the time. And then after about a year of making all the mistakes, okay, we start to get a little bit smarter, and then we start to realize what you really want to do is shrink the problem. And the way you shrink the problem is you work with people and you explain people, you give them options. Joe Biden, what Biden is doing, he is not in, he's trying to encourage people to see the consequences of what they're doing. And by the way, there's other things that folks can do if they really want to get at this. They just take Michigan away from the Democrats. That's going to be a lesson. That's going to be a lesson. So the idea that it has to be the violence and violent speech is the only way, I don't think so. I think there are other peaceful ways that are far more effective and challenging here. If you really want to get the administration's attention, you just throw the Democratic Party under the bus in November for real. That's going to change things. And a lot of folks on the Palestinian side, they really do believe that. And I think that is a far more effective way if you really want to, but that's not what's happening. Right now, it's probably the other way around.
One of the ways for students today to get the attention that they're getting nationally, coverage on New York Times and ABC and NBC and whatever, is by creating these conflicts. Right? And that's the point of it, I think. And it's perfectly understandable from their perspective. Right? I mean, if they want people to be thinking about these issues from their perspective, then the way to get them to do so is to get it out there. And part of the challenge is that they're right. That is the way to get it out there. We probably would not be having this conversation today if they hadn't been doing what they've been doing for the last several months.
Well, you said in your comments, in your response, we want protests on college campuses. This is healthy. I think, the Calvin Report says a good university, a great university like Socrates will be upsetting.
But the point is that protests on college campuses are great. But what's going on here is beyond that.
So that's
and it's beyond that in order to get visibility. Right? And it's understandable.
That visibility that transcends the bounds of the institution.
Right. And the challenge that the university faces is, on the one hand, you want to respect their students' and others' ability to express what they care about and to get attention for what they care about, but not in a way that interferes in a serious way with the functioning of the institution.
Right.
And so, I think that the approach that we seem to be taking here is that it would have been perfectly consistent with our standards for the university to have told the students who are now protesting, you can't do this in the Central Quadrangle. This is just not consistent with the time, place, and manner restrictions that we have. We would apply to anybody. It's neutral. It has nothing to do with any opposition to what you're saying, but you can't put these tents up in the middle of the quadrangles. And the fact that we're not going after that right now, I think, is a way of both respecting the free speech element of this, but on the other side, there's a point at which, how do you end it? How do you get to the point where it's ending? And that's the real challenge.
So you do see something of a violation and infringement on time, place, manner restrictions.
Oh,
in what
absolutely.
you said. And do I also hear a sense of balancing various institutional goods and priorities, such as free speech and allowing for some of that?
Sure, you always decide whether to enforce law, even if somebody's violating it, if you think that the benefit of enforcing it outweighs the cost of allowing somebody to do something. But I have no doubt that the protests that put up tents and so on in the Central Quads are inconsistent with the time, place, and manner restrictions and regulations that the university and almost all universities have. But
Yeah.
yeah, but
That's demonstrably true.
yeah.
Dean Michelle Rasmussen couldn't be with us today, but wrote a note to the university
Yeah.
community linking to policies that back what you're saying and saying you're on notice for violating.
No, I think what his memo, I think, was exactly right by saying that, this is not
And
consistent.
our president wrote a memo the same.
Yeah, the president, right. This is not right. This is not consistent with the restrictions of the university. But we also understand why you're so determined to do this, and we think it's your need to do this, your desire to do this outweighs our need to shut you down. That wouldn't be the case if they were using loudspeakers in the classrooms.
Right. And this is a dynamic, changing situation, obviously. So this seems to be where we are now.
Right.
So, Jeff, one of the things that really worries me about doing nothing is the flash nature of the way violence can erupt. And that's something that, so when you say, well, we're just going to enforce the law, well, that presumes you can stop that flash nature.
Right.
See what I mean? And in the world we live in, we're just having a harder and harder time stopping that flash violence. If you think of the riots during the George Floyd protests, if you think of the January 6th, if you think of what's happening, the more violent parts, it's happening quickly, very, very quickly. Decision makers are trying to keep up with all that, but this is happening often when they're exhausted, and it doesn't take, days and days. It can take literally 30 minutes to have that flash violence occur. And so I worry that if we really do, as a university, decide we're not going to do anything, even not inform about future speech, we're really setting up the possibility then of that greater violence that won't be able to be fully offset. And then the consequences of that are going to be much worse than the consequences of trying to inform future speech. So I don't think there's much downside with the option I'm calling for. You're worried about effectiveness, okay?
What is the option you're calling for?
I'm calling for 100. I'm sorry. I'm calling for 100 universities.
I meant in terms of the students sitting in, putting up tents.
No, I'm not. I'm saying inform the entire student body and their parents and every faculty member about the tragic misunderstanding that we found in our study. That one table, I'm saying, is single table. Maybe put on TikTok. I don't know all the ways to communicate these days. But that one table will not just simply have a narrow consequence with that, but it will be a move beyond anything that's happening now for student safety. That will be a public move by student safety, and that is that small little bit of positive consequence I'm saying can have some cascading effects. But to do nothing here in a situation where flash mobs can erupt immediately, and not even necessarily due to students, as I'm explaining, this can, the cooperation or overlap between the non-students and the students, highly similar views, so to speak. I think this is just waiting for something worse to happen, which is what usually happens in democracy. Usually we don't do anything until it gets so bad. You see what I mean? And I'm trying to find a way to avoid that negative trajectory.
I wonder if we might open it up for
Yeah.
discussion more broadly. So there will be a couple folks up front and mics here for those in the audience that would like to approach and share your thoughts, ask your questions. And I know we're also getting some activity online, some questions that are coming through our viewers who are watching the live stream. I do want to ask while that's getting set up, for you, Professor Pape, you go back to, I think what you're saying is an exemplary performance, utterance by President Biden this morning. that seems to be a model for what you'd like to see university leaders doing as well. And he's
I'd
saying clearly.
Yes, I'd like to see university leaders do that, but I'd like to see Gavin Newsom do that. I just went on the radio just before here in Los Angeles saying exactly that. I would like to see our Democratic leaders in general follow President Biden's example. I'd like to see Hakeem Jeffries do that. I'd like to basically, have every leader in the country. Actually, I'd be perfectly happy if Speaker Johnson would make exactly the same statement. If we literally could have the same statement delivered by all 435 members of Congress, or 438 members of Congress and 100 senators, this would be just a tremendous step forward, way beyond anything that we've seen. And by the way, there are Republican students on campus, Democratic students on campus. There's a lot of good reason to be doing this on this issue, and I think that the fact is President Biden, he's a Democrat, and he stood up to Democrats on his side at a very tight time for him politically, and that is something we can either just ignore it or others can get behind and take his lead.
Thank you for that. Hey, why don't we start on this side and we'll bounce around, please.
So first, let me thank you for having this event. It's been really informative and very refreshing to hear some level-headed discussion on all these topics, which I know can be very charged. I did want to ask Professor Stone a question about these neutrality principles, and in particular, you mentioned there's this decision to make with any law as to whether you decide to enforce it or not. And my question is essentially, to what extent does deciding not to enforce policies that are being violated constitute an expression on behalf of the university of taking a stance one way or the other?
Well, in my view, the university should not decide not to enforce a regulation because of the viewpoint being expressed by the people who are violating the regulation. That would be, I think, completely inappropriate. On the other hand, in the circumstances of any given situation, one might conclude that there's more to gain than to lose by not enforcing something. Not because you have a particular view about the viewpoint of the speakers, but because the practical consequences of enforcing it are X or Y. And also because you understand that this is an effective way of communicating. I mean, at this moment, this is an effective way of communicating by getting this attention. And it's not all that disruptive. But I would say that should be the same thing that the university should do, regardless of the message that's being communicated by the students.
Thank you.
Professor Pape, can you hear me? Yeah. In order to understand what seems to be a very strong point that you're making, you tie it to a particular slide, and you referenced it as having to do with tragic misunderstandings. And we saw a lot of slides, so I wonder if you would just clarify what slide.
Oh my goodness gracious! I don't know if that. I would love to do that if we can get the AV to. Let's just keep that up. I like that idea. Let's see.
Not sure if that's.
Let's see. I think we have to ask.
I don't know if that's so
we will try to see if we can figure that out. How to make this happen? If we can.
There we go.
Oh, there we are. Just a minute. Oh, okay. So just give me a second. Yeah, so this is the one slide I'm talking about, and let me just go over it just again. So a lot of people have asked questions, can you name the river and the sea? And we did that too. It's very interesting and clever and so forth, but for political violence, you want to know intent, because as I explained, it's what the listener is hearing is the reality, that's the perception, that's their reality, and that's what they respond to both for threat and for incitement. So it is very important to know, what do people think that statement means? And what you see is we have three options. We said, well, it could mean that Palestinians and Israelis live in a two-state solution, two separate countries. That implies peace. It could also be Palestinians and Israelis should live together in one state, but also there's nothing negative there. It sort of could imply peace. You see, so another peaceful option. Then there's the third, which is that phrase means the expulsion and genocide of Israeli Jews. Just that way. And then the fourth is don't know what it means. So we've got to give them a don't know, or else it's not fair in the question. And what you see is 31% of students don't know what the phrase means, but you might say, wow, you're surprised. No, it's actually amazing. It's 31% and not 66%. You see, so that's really right off the bat. Very, very interesting. And then what you see is two are tied for number one. They're not really different, the 26 and the 27, and one's a little bit further behind. So the bottom line is that the idea that this means genocide is just as open as anything else. It's not like it's lower down, and that's my point, that this is not an uncommon, rare understanding. That phrase is commonly understood to mean the genocide of Jews, as commonly as anything else. Now, of course, let's look at then the background of the students, because they come from different backgrounds, and we can do that here. So we looked at Jewish students, and then you see, well, for Jewish students, 66% hear that phrase, and they think it means genocide, expulsion of the Jews. And many of them will know, and of course I've studied political violence for a long time, that that's a phrase particularly used by Hamas. That's a very famous connection. I didn't bring that up before because I'm not trying to, kind of booger this and kill it, but that is something that probably would happen. But actually interesting, the Muslim students here, they actually, only 14% of them report that they think it means the expulsion or genocide of the Jews. And actually, look, it means the two-state solution. You see what I mean? So what's really interesting about this is that what you are seeing here is not the certainty that people are not strategically answering. So let me just say right off the bat, of course, not naive enough to think people are not, there's strategy involved in everything that a lot of folks do, right? However, by publicizing this widely, showing there's a you could even say potential tragic misunderstanding, okay, to cover the base of the uncertainty. What this does is it really does take away the myth that only a few people think it means expulsion of Jews, and it's really only the Jews who think that. What that does is show it's much more than just the Jewish community on campus is about 7%. So it can't possibly be that that's the sum total of the Jews. You see what I mean? No. So that's what I'm sorry to go on, but I just want to emphasize, and we'll leave this up for people to see. That's what I'm asking those 100 colleges and universities to get behind. And if it's the top 100, well then you're getting a vast number of the many millions here because they're so huge. You see, so if we could really get the people listening on this live stream to see that one and actually take that step, I think that would be absolutely a positive step forward, because I think it would have several potential positive benefits, and I see no possible downside.
So, what's the steps that you want them to take?
I want them to not necessarily mail, but email that slide, probably a little nicer version of it with done, we would hire, Jeremy, we'd get Jeremy to do a nicer version of this, okay? So, but rather, every year they're mailing all kinds of stuff for alumni, we have lots of people that we email all the time here.
Sure.
This, I think, I want them to email it to every student, every faculty member, every staff member, every parent of every student, and every alumni. So what I really want those 100 universities to do is to treat it like they would treat their fundraising campaigns. That really, they have these efforts, and what we're really talking about is probably about a day of their time, one day for, folks like Jeremy, to the media folks, to make a nice version of this and explain it, and then a day to send this out. But if those 100 universities would do that, that's a pretty big step.
What's the lesson from that?
The lesson, sorry.
No, that's exactly my question.
Yeah.
What's the lesson? I mean, it's very confusing, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think you were raising the question earlier, Jeff, about just efficacy. Like, is it going to work? And
Yeah, but what would be the consequences of having 100 universities send this out?
The consequences are that we now know that phrase is understood by a quarter of all students as an actual call for genocide today. That's not a hypothetical in the future. So Elise Stefanik's question back on December 6th, hers was a hypothetical. What if universities called for genocide? There's no what if. There's no what if. There's no word genocide in From the River to the Sea, but 26% of the college students hearing that hear that as a call for genocide.
But that's
So-
from the perspective of the hearer.
That's what I'm saying. That's
And
exactly
that's
right.
where it gets complicated, because the response often, and I've talked with faculty members here, is that's not the intent at all. Let's get clear on the intent.
Well, the other thing you need to add is that
Of the speaker.
the fear comes from not the intent of the speaker, but the perception of the listener. So the other thing I would add to that, a little bit longer than simply one slide. So I think literally it couldn't be just that one slide. You'd need that second point, that when it comes to fear, it's the perception, not the intent. So it's the perception that's the reality. And so when you hear folks say, well, I don't mean that,
Yeah.
and just put it in another context. So the Confederate flag issue. We had a big issue in 2015 in South Carolina because they were flying the Confederate flag over the state capitol. And Nikki Haley got national fame because she took it down. They had exactly this, well, maybe not the same numbers, but a very similar issue. Many folks said, no, I don't mean that there should be harm to Black Americans. I just want to have freedom, you see, which is similar to what we're seeing here. But no, this was actually causing quite a bit of perception of harm, regardless of what the intent was to fly the flag. Many, not just African Americans, but many thought that Confederate flag was like a symbol that it's okay to harm en masse African Americans. Very similar thing here. So I'm just saying that clarifying the different perceptions, what does that do? And also adding the point above that what causes the fear is not your intent, the intent of the speaker, but it's what the listener hears and understands. So another thing that protesters could do, based on this knowledge, is keep that phrase, from the river to the sea, and then immediately add chants for the two-state solution. 42% of Muslims support that, okay? So so when you say, what would be the ripple effect consequences, I'm not trying to dictate them. I'm just trying to point out that what this says is there's actual confusion by the listener.
Yeah.
So let's clarify that for the listener. If we really don't mean the expulsion and genocide of the Jews, and it really is the two-state solution, then why not say it?
I wonder if there's a little bit of forest and trees here. Like the big thing is that there is a symmetry of fear, if you can use that term, if you might disagree with that, that is especially preponderant with Muslim and Jewish students for various reasons. And perhaps responsible leadership is naming that there's widespread fear in both of these populations. I think the tree, if you will, is the precise tactical move of sending this or putting it on TikTok or whatever is one tactic, which I can imagine is complicated because I think there are elements of the hard Israeli right, like Likud Party has a history of using river to sea in different ways. And then you get into rhetoric about Judea and Samaria and what that means. And so you can imagine other tactics that seek to calm multiple angles and sides.
I could easily imagine others. The thing we have here is the hard survey evidence on the different meanings in real time or near real time, not next year or 5 years from now. And it deals directly with that issue of a call for genocide. That is the reason to focus on this now and not to say, well, let's do some more studies and let's wait 5 years and so forth. I hear that, and I'm not opposed to those future studies. We're a center, so
But you're highlighting
Kevin Ruby, our research director, is right there, folks.
there's clearly a current
There's a current need. Joe Biden could have not given that speech today. He could have said, no, I'll wait a week or two and let's just see what happens a little bit further. No, truth is I wish he'd given the speech a week ago, all right? But this was a very reasonable time to give that speech. This is the reasonable time to decide to do this. And yes, there needs to be a bit more explained. There needs to be this context. But if the pushback is from those who don't like it, that, well, I never intended that to mean well, then they should be they should be liking and forwarding the message, reposting it. Because what this will do is then clarify for those folks who say, well, people think when I use from the river to the sea, I mean genocide of Jews. No, I'm part of that 40, no, I mean the two-state solution. I mean the two-state solution. Well, what that's going to do is just, it reframes this and makes it the case that then the speaker is being encouraged to clarify a peaceful meaning.
Yeah, well put.
So the point of this is simply to educate those people who use this phrase that it has consequences they don't intend.
We'll write that down.
Please.
This question is also for Professor Pape. I am an undergrad at UChicago, and it'd be great if UChicago sends this slide out to everyone, but it seems like most student encampments here and across the country is not for broad geopolitical outcomes. For example, at UChicago and at Columbia, protesters have pretty specific demands about disclose and divest. How do you think the group of 100 or so universities should address this? And also as a follow-up, do you think investment or divestment is an expression on the part of the university?
So first of all, in line with what Jeff thinks, I certainly think calls for divestment are perfectly right, and I would not say we should be restricting them. Point number one. Point number two, though, is I would say that things are a little bit different than you present it as calls for divestment. What I see when we even look at our Chicago Tribune article on this very issue is a whole set of demands. And I see that demands are different at Northwestern, and they're different in California, and they're different. And so what I would say is there's probably, our research team was trying to count this up a couple days ago. We think there's about a dozen different demands floating around here, and it's not quite clear, because divestment doesn't just mean divestment for some from Israel, it means the military-industrial complex, which can be half of the S&P 500, and so what that means is what I'm trying to tell you is not just multiple, but it's not clear that there's a unified position. And I think that's really a challenge, because what it means is that when one university makes concessions to that group, it may have those concessions may have no effect on what the folks at UCLA want or what the folks at Columbia want. It's just not relevant to them, if you see what I mean. So I think right now, this is not like the Vietnam War, where in the Vietnam War, it was the students versus the establishment because of the draft is a huge thing. It wasn't the only thing, to be sure, but it was a big part of it. And the 60s effectively ended in 1974 when we ended the draft. So the 60s still went into the 70s until we ended the draft. You see what I mean? And that's because that's what those students, one of the big things they had in common, and they were really pushing for that problem of not getting drafted and then dying in the Vietnam War. Here, it's just not yet congealed. And I would even say compared to the George Floyd protests. So the George Floyd protests pretty clearly started with an instance of police brutality. And then pretty quickly, protesters, they may have started with some sets of issues, but they started to focus on defund the police. Well, when you're then protesting at municipalities to change a budget that's going to be renewed every year, that's a lot tighter fit. Do you see what I mean? Between the action that triggered it and then the result. Here, I just think it hasn't gotten to that, hasn't become that clear. And so I think that the idea of the demands, the concessions, I don't think we're seeing these tight relationships here yet. Now, maybe in months or weeks, this will evolve.
The university faced this issue about South Africa, of course, and decided not to divest, in large part because of the Calvin report. And again, part of the concern is once you allow yourself to be manipulated in that way, it's just more demands will be made, more demands, disinvest in this, because we think it's offensive. And do you want to go there?
I think that, to the best of my understanding, and I think you'll know more about this, that captures what has been stated as the official reasons and positions. This came up in the Darfur genocide as well, and it's coming up again now.
Right.
Yeah, I think I would just say repeat what I said. I think that the thing that we have seen in the last several months that has made the biggest difference is the not vote for Joe Biden in the primaries. That's made a huge difference, and that's the thing that I think this may or may not fit with that. I can't really tell at this moment. It may be a distraction from that, but that was what got the Biden administration's attention for sure. And I think that's where you saw real movement here. And so I think that that's just, and I'm just reading what happened just in the last few months.
Maybe there's a deeper element to this question. Maybe I'm just hearing it that way, but I'm especially interested in your opinion on this, Professor Sohn, and you can share, of course, if you feel so inclined. Do you think that interpretation is consistent with Calvin and principles of institutional neutrality? So I think the official university position has been to understand neutrality to mean divestment would in fact constitute a political or social action that...
Yeah, if you were
Calvin...
divesting because of political, social reasons, not for financial reasons, then it would be taking a position on these issues. And I think it is consistent with Calvin to say that the university should not divest because of the university having a position about some issue out there. And so, yeah, I do think that's consistent with Calvin.
Yep. Thank you for that. Do you have more questions?
Yes, I'm going to read some of the questions that we've been getting online, and I've bundled them together. Thank you for everyone who's sending them. Please feel free to keep sending questions. This is a question for Professor Stone. So private universities have to balance a commitment to free expression with Title VI and Title IX. For example, if a Jewish student is complaining that it's unsafe for them, that could lead to discrimination claims. A specific example that some of our questioners sent is Columbia's example that a student said, Zionists don't deserve to live. That student said that. So how should private universities navigate these concerns between these free expression and Title VI and Title IX?
I mean, my own view is that speech by students does not violate Title VI or Title IX, and because it's not the university's action or speech.
Is there a further question to that? I guess I would invite you to say more.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. So what about my understanding?
If the university was discriminating, that would be different.
Right.
That's what's prohibited. But if the university is simply letting students say what they want on either side, then it's not violating Title VI or Title IX.
How do you understand, I'm not trained in the law, but how do you understand the parameters around hostile environment, which goes to Title VI, Title IX, the Civil Rights Act? My understanding is the conditions that are pervasive enough to impede the rightful participation in the privileges and opportunities of an educational or workplace environment could be such that they constitute a hostile environment for those protected classes. Does that interpretation, one, is that true and more or less accurate? And if so, that pertains to more than simply the actions of those in leadership positions in the university and the administration. It pertains to the environment, right?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding, I'm not an expert on Title VI or Title IX, but my understanding is that what it does is to prohibit the institution from doing certain things, not students or whatever. So I don't think that would violate Title VI or Title IX. Now, if the university took action sometimes and not other times, that would be a different issue. But if basically what one's concerned about is if there's students, for example, making other students uncomfortable, then that's not a violation of Title VI or Title IX.
Do you agree with the line of logic that if those in charge, administrators, allow an environment in which student speech and expression has gotten to the point that it reasonably constitutes a hostile environment for certain populations, that implies a failure of responsibility on behalf of those administrators? Or is that a stretch?
I mean, as a matter of policy, I think it makes sense. As a matter of whether it violates Title VI or Title IX, I don't know. But certainly as a matter of policy, I think universities should not be treating groups differently who are being disadvantaged in the same way, that would be, I think, inappropriate. So if you have students who are offending Muslim students and Jewish students, and the university only takes action against one group rather than the other, that would be impermissible and probably would violate the federal law.
I have some more questions if there's nothing else from the floor or over the transom on this. Oh, please go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't see you in the lights.
Yeah, thank you both for being here. I think my question would be primarily for Professor Stone, although to the extent that either of you are knowledgeable on this or would like to answer, I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts, especially with respect to the second part of my question. So, as Professor Pape alluded to just a moment ago, we saw a while back presidents of Harvard and Pennsylvania being grilled by Congress as to whether certain calls or certain speech, namely like calls for genocide or statements interpreted as calls for genocide, would constitute violations of university codes of conduct. And obviously, I take it that these statements are generally allowed by the First Amendment, but I imagine there's probably like a separate question as to like whether or not there's disciplinary action that a university could take against students who violate the codes of conduct. So with that said, would these statements be typically in violation of university codes of conduct? And to the extent they are, would you take the view that these codes of conduct should be changed to accommodate this kind of speech on campus? Thank you both.
So private universities are not governed by the First Amendment, so they can punish whatever speech they want in general. Should they punish advocacy of genocide? Obviously, that's hateful and ugly speech, but at the same time, you open the door to, well, genocide of whom, right? Does it make any difference who it's being called for? How realistic is the call? Is the purpose of it, in fact, to intimidate as opposed to actually call for genocide? So again, I think that I think the Supreme Court's view about this as a First Amendment matter is the correct one, which is that you don't punish the speech unless it actually creates a serious and immediate danger. And I know that's often seen as not giving enough protection to people, but the opposite side of that, which is what the court has learned, is that if you give leaders discretion to do these things, you're inviting all sorts of abuse, and you don't want to go there.
So then if I could just kind of push a little bit here, because back to the flash mob analogy. So I'm taking seriously that, again, flash mobs, cell phones, a lot of things can happen very quickly. So does that mean, Jeff, that we should say that not as part of a change of the code of conduct, but as an elaboration of what fits under the code of conduct, if your chants actually trigger a mob to attack and storm a building, then you are liable for those chants? Is that what it means to be imminent there? Well, you see what I mean?
Yeah, well, under First Amendment law, the answer would be, did you specifically intend to cause that to happen? And was it likely to happen imminently? And was the harm grave? And the Supreme Court has never, since 1960s, upheld a conviction of any person because of their advocacy of unlawful conduct, because the test is so demanding. Now, again, private universities aren't subject to that. They could do very different things. But again, it seems crazy that the court has gone as far as it has. But again, the reason it's gone as far as it has, it's learned from its experience. It's learned from the mistakes. And opening the door to allowing people to be held accountable because others engaged in illegal conduct means you can punish people for criticizing the war, because that means some people will refuse induction into the military, and it's illegal to do that. So you've encouraged them to refuse induction into the military. That's where you don't want to go.
So that I would say then, given the hard edge on that, that pushes me even more toward the arguments I've been making about informing future speech. And also not just for the legal reasons that you're mentioning, but because of the political issues here of universities being viewed as not caring about the harm to their students. Because if it turns out that there can't be a change in that because of exactly what you said, then telling universities, well, they shouldn't do anything when there's harm coming to the students, that's a real problem under this set of circumstances. I would just say the informing future speech option is one that I think should be at least plowed more deeply. I don't think anybody's pushing on that door. And I'm sure we have a lot of folks with triple-digit IQs that could come up with a lot of good ways to make use of that.
Right.
Please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this. I'm a law student, and so this made me think about the heckler veto problem. I'm just wondering how much of what we're talking about is a problem of, something else that our Supreme Court has rejected, which is like attributing the violence that we're worried about to the speech that we don't like, because we're worried about the reaction to it. Professor Stone can kind of probably see what I'm saying and answer this better.
Well, the concept of the heckler's veto is that individuals will heckle a speaker in order to disrupt the speech and to prevent the speaker from continuing or to having the audience hear it. And as long as you have a neutral rule that applies to anyone who engages in that behavior, that would be a perfectly permissible thing to prohibit. That is, you're not allowed to get up in the middle of somebody's speech and disrupt the speech as long as the university or the state applies that regardless of who the speaker is or who the heckler is.
I've understood it as like the line, so to speak, is infringing on the other legitimate individual's right to speak. And at that point, you're infringing on someone else's liberties.
Right, exactly.
This is a question that's come for Professor Pape. So one of the recommendations that you shared was for universities to educate that there is one political solution to this century-long conflict, and that'll help resolve some of not only the Middle East, but also within campuses today, and that's the two-state solution. How should universities take that step in advocating for that, if they are up for that? And what should they do if they're unwilling to make that political advocacy leap?
So first of all, remember, these are recommendations for both national leaders and university leaders. So what you're seeing in those 4 recommendations is, yes, it would be great if both of the national political leaders and the university leaders were on a same page. But I just want to be very upfront with that 4th recommendation, that's really a recommendation heavily for our national political leaders, which you could say, well, doesn't President Biden already do that? He does about what happens overseas. No one is making the connection yet between recognizing that the two-state solution that has benefits here at home as well. What I would say is that I think what universities could do about that is they could add, you see Dartmouth is already moving in a direction to do more to try to respond to student needs and desire to be educated more on the history. So I was teaching strategy, my big class, in the fall when this all unfolded. And I can just tell you that when this unfolded, yes, there were some students who, thought they knew, and we're at Chicago, they all thought they knew it, right? But there was quite a few students who really, really want to stay after class and just learn a little bit more about some of the historical background. So I can definitely see where how Dartmouth came up with the ideas that they did. I would just add to that a point to recognize the two-state solution is the only option that's not zero-sum. Now, maybe there are folks who want a zero-sum option where one side gets it all. But I think that's what I'm really clarifying. I'm not clarifying that it must be that as the preferred outcome. It's that's the only one on the table, the two-state solution, which is not zero-sum. That's the part that I think is maybe missed here. The other solutions are just, even if they're well-meaning in some way, but I don't know how the genocide one would be well-meaning, but even if the other solutions really have underneath them a zero-sum character where, then we have to divide that loaf, and once I get 30%, I'm going to want 40, I'm going to want 50, I'm going to want it all, if it's really that way. So that's what I'm really asking universities to do there. It's educating about the consequences of the two-state solution a little bit more. That's why I tied it to the zero-sum nature of it.
And to build on that, another question we've been receiving is how should educators go about helping students learn how to communicate. For example, they have every right to say, from the river to the sea. They have every right to call for, and say whatever they want to say. But how can educators say, there's probably a better way to communicate that? What's the role of morality in guiding this that perhaps university professors can share?
Well, I really take seriously that we're having a major problem. We're so tightly connected online that we're not connected with each other anymore. And I think that one of the things that just happened with the experience I just told you about my strategy class, where people just, they wanted to stay. It wasn't a problem where they really wanted more. And I think that if universities maybe would, and they won't stop the professors from doing that, but I'm not sure that, I think they could do just a little bit more to encourage this idea of when we have a strife that's happening, some extra time here would be good, because think of all the professors here who are coming up for tenure, and every days and hours they don't spend on that means they're out of job and they're back in their parents' home. So this is a really serious issue for not recognizing community benefits here that are really quite valuable, but they don't just show up on your CV. And so what I would say is I think universities could do a little bit more to recognize that for the faculty.
I think one of the responsibilities of a university for both faculty and students is to encourage them to engage in a constructive rather than non-constructive discourse. And to do that with, entering students, to have programs where you talk about that and have policies that don't demand it, but basically say, this is who we are as an institution, right? We want to learn from each other, we want to disagree with each other, we can argue with each other, but the whole point is to do it in a rational, serious, responsible manner, not to be name-calling and not to be unnecessarily hurtful. And I think it's important for institutions to generate that culture. Mm-hmm. And I think we do that pretty well here, frankly.
Yeah. It's good to hear that, especially from you. So that there's this notion that just because you should be allowed to say it, doesn't mean you should say it.
Right.
But that's really at the heart of that question.
We all do that every day. Mm-hmm. And we all know that there are things that we're allowed to say that we don't say.
Right.
Right. And that's what people should be doing.
Well, if I could just say, so I'm actually an alum, as you probably know, from the 80s. But on the strength of the University of Chicago, I really can't imagine doing this study this fast anywhere else, not just because of speed and not just because of money and time, but because when we did this study, literally did not know what the results were going to be. Mm-hmm. No idea what those results were going to be, but we were committed they were going to come out whatever the results were going to be. That, being at the University of Chicago, that's a very special thing. Mm-hmm. We can do that at the University of Chicago, and we have done that over and over, so it's not the first time, of course, but it is really of great strength of the University of Chicago that we really are trying to find out and allow the freedom to search for the answers wherever the chips happen to fall. Mm-hmm. And so this was not biased in one way or the other. This just come out, this is what the results are. Mm-hmm. And I think that really speaks well to where the culture of the University of Chicago is in the landscape of the world.
Yeah, I agree.
Mm-hmm. I'd invite you, Professor Pape, to say a little bit more about this notion of, we have, I think you said potentially 100 universities coming together to, so imagine 100 presidents and provosts or something.
Yeah.
Doing what? Signing a joint letter, like recognizing the interinstitutional dynamic at play
So I
here.
think joint letters, I don't think would go very far in this environment with that 100 university. I do think what would be helpful is if they gave very similar, I do think copying Joe Biden's statement almost word for word would be an extremely valuable thing to do for each of them to do. Individually, and I would say they should do it on a video. Mm-hmm. His statement, I think this morning, was literally 3 minutes, so that it's like perfect for shooting around. And so what I would say is not a joint statement by them. There may be some actors where that would be valuable. I don't think here. I think the statement would be more of a video statement. It would come out, it would be almost word for word here, because what he did is he's recognizing the principles that are in conflict. He's recognizing the harm to the multiple different communities on campus, and then he's pretty firmly saying saying that harm is not acceptable. And so I think that whether that's as the institutional hat or as the professorial hat, I think doesn't really, I'm not sure that's going to ultimately matter. I think what's going to matter is whether that gets shotgunned out to the 40,000 emails that we have at the University of Chicago. And then I would say separately, the thing that should come together would be the coordination around the tragic misunderstanding so that we get the key points, which is, again, the perception is the reality, and here the perception is that for at least a quarter of the students, it is an actual call for genocide. And so if you're walking by the quad and you're hearing a call for genocide, that is going to be unnerving, and I don't think it takes that much to believe it would be unnerving, Jeff. So I know maybe people are kind of strategizing a bit about that, but I'm not sure that's true. And I think that that would be a step forward, and that would be for each of their individual institutions, but for the American university system in general. Because if we really do perpetuate this idea that it's just what we get out of it as professors, and you see on TV, we're constantly painted as the worst of the worst, right? I mean, this is just, well, that's not going to last. There's nothing in the Constitution that says professors must have tenure, and I don't see anywhere, I missed the amendment about the endowments, that we get to keep our endowments, and I missed the tax-exempt status part in the Constitution. Maybe I didn't take the right class, but I'm just saying that these issues, we can laugh about them and we could say, oh, those things would never happen. Yeah, no president sitting would ever organize an effort to have stop the peaceful transfer of power. No, that could never happen. We would never see anything like that. Do you see what I mean? We're living in an era where some pretty strange things have happened. I think we should take seriously that we should come together to provide some clear benefit that we care about our students. We want them to flourish. We don't just want to protect them minimally. We want them to flourish on campus. Well, I don't know how you can flourish if you're saying, well, okay, they're calling for the genocide of Jews today. Is that African Americans tomorrow? What about, who's next on the list? And when next person comes in politically, maybe it's the Muslims. You see, who's next, I think, is a big problem.
Yeah.
Tony's.
Yeah. Well, I'll ask. Do either of you have anything to ask of the other before we close? I think we.
I would just say that the work that you've done is just amazing. It's really just amazing. And those of you who haven't seen the 750 pages, you should take a look at it. It weighs like that.
It's a great doorstop.
Well, Professor Stone, Professor Pape, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Tony. You were just terrific. And thank you all for being here, and those online. Jeff, really, that was just absolutely brilliant.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
You're amazing.